to what extent might it be that overuse of technology is a contributing factor to this situation where people are feeling cognitively exhausted and emotionally exhausted? If we can show that connection, then I think we can demonstrate that overuse of technology is at least a contributing factor, if not the sole factor, leading to cyber fatigue. Hello, my name's Peter Coroneos from the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, and I'm very honoured today to be speaking to Baroness Professor Susan Greenfield, who is a very, very well-known and highly regarded neuroscientist from Oxford University. So, Susan, thank you for your time today.
It was my pleasure. A very important subject.
I have, for a long time, thought that the human behavioural aspect of cybersecurity was really at the core of why we still see attacks occurring as we have, and in fact have increased during COVID. But also, prior career, I did teach a little bit of neuroscience and evolutionary biology. And I sort of started thinking a few years ago, I wonder if there's a neurological correlate to the behaviours, the risk behaviours that we're seeing. And then further, because I've been aware of your work, from, I think the first paper you published to the children was around 2011, roughly?
About then, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It started in 2009 when I made a speech in the Lords, and then everything evolved after that. Yeah.
So just to sort of backtrack to that, your basic premise then, which you then showed experimentally, was that the internet usage is an environmental factor, just like any other environmental factor. And as we understand from the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, changes in our environment will result in changes in the brain. That's putting it at a very sort of high level. And so your research indicated that in children who are still in a highly developmental stage of brain development, that excessive internet use was likely to result in changes to their brains in ways that were not necessarily desirable. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
No, that's absolutely right. Although I'd say it's not just children, although they're the most vulnerable, because they don't have the same sales resistance that the adult might have, having had decades of what we could call a normal childhood in 3 dimensions and all 5 senses being stimulated. So yes, certainly children in particular, but not just children.
So was it later research where you sort of extended the hypothesis into the adult population, or was there additional research?
No, it was always based, as you correctly say, on the plasticity of the brain, which of course is much more apparent in young children. The Jesuits saying, give me a child till they're 7, I will give you the man. So because they don't, as I say, have the sales resistance, because as you're growing, obviously you develop your own view of the world, your own frameworks, your own concepts and so on, so that anything coming in has to pass the gatekeepers of your existing values and prejudices and experiences. If you're a kid, you haven't got those things, so you're much more vulnerable. So when you're very small, you are only evaluating the world in sensory terms because you don't have existing memories and associations and connections. But as you mature, obviously, you build up your own framework of understanding of the world, and you'll interpret what comes in through that. So the more you have that, the more that will counterbalance whatever's coming in. Whereas, as we know from that Jesuit quote, if you're very young, you'll just swallow it wholesale.
Right. I'll return to this point later in the conversation, because there was another dimension to some of the issues we're seeing within cybersecurity that I think are more applicable to adults and may still have negative effects on behavior, but for different reasons, but they may still have a neurological correlate. So, but before I do that, so thank you for sort of confirming my understanding of the research. I note that since that original work came out, And there was some controversy around it. I think there was some.
Not surprisingly, yeah.
Well, I'm reminded, I think, was it Karl Popper, the science philosopher, was talking about the three phases of discovery.
Yeah.
In the first stage, you're deemed, you're ridiculed, and then in the second stage, you're attacked. And in the third phase, what you said is accepted as if it was self-evident.
Everyone says they always knew it all along. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's been many studies, even before the screen appeared as an issue, where people have done rather short-term activities with subjects and shown changes. Juggling, for example, is one
Right.
one stage. So it's really well known that if you ask volunteers to do something for a sustained period of time, even over a short period of time, then you'll start to see changes in the brain. So that just reflects the plasticity of the brain. Yeah. I think where such studies like that, you have to be careful, is you don't then say the parietal cortex is the center for this or the center for that.
No.
Yeah, it just shows that clearly it's having an effect.
Well, that was the area they looked at.
Yeah, so, and there's been, since 2011, there's been studies showing changes in the brain with video, with internet disorders and so on. So,
well, now with that background, Susan, I wanted to move slightly sideways into cybersecurity and what the implications of our discussion so far in this research might show for people working in the field, in my field. And I'll just quote from a briefing point that I'd made for this discussion, where I said, in cybersecurity, we're finding that in some circumstances, people seem to be less able to discern a malicious email. And there's an emerging phenomenon which is known as cyber fatigue, characterized by a switching off and a disengagement. So we're seeing a behavioral shift apparently occurring. And research from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's NIST in America, which is one of the really 2 or 3 international standards making bodies around cybersecurity assurance, has actually appointed a behavioral psychologist, at least one, and they did this research in 2016. And what they found was that they see cognitive and emotional exhaustion as being factors contributing to changes in mood, attitude, and feelings. But further, these affective changes are seen as underlying causes of fatigue, which in turn are impacting on the ability to make appropriate decisions about whether to trust a communication, such as a phishing email. And as you know, wrong decisions can result in attackers getting through. So effectively, and what I'm trying to do here, I'm moving towards trying to form a connection, which may or may not be valid, but I'll put it to you anyway. To what extent might it be that overuse of technology is a contributing factor to this situation where people are feeling cognitively exhausted and emotionally exhausted? Because if we can show that connection, then I think we can demonstrate that overuse of technology is at least a contributing factor, if not the sole factor, leading to cyber fatigue.
Yeah. Well, I think let's start at the very simplest level of fatigue. There's a huge burden on your sensory system when you're looking at the screen. You're staring at it, and this has been shown by someone called Richard Cytowicz, Cytowicz, Richard Cytowicz, who's a neurologist, and especially for young people, and especially for very young kids, it really can be quite damaging, the eye strain that occurs from reading from the screen. It's also been shown that if you read from a screen rather than a paper book, say, then again, you're much more exhausted reading from a screen than a book. It's just the light, and the eye strain. So even that, then also, if you're focusing on just one thing all the time, a screen, that can be, people I think acknowledge, and they do advise that you should take time out and should focus on a distance just to rest. So the very fact of working at a screen, not moving, sitting, can be exhausting and tiring. So I think at the very basic level of the senses, yes. And then, of course, repetitive activity can be very tiring, and you actually lose your discriminating abilities if you are just doing the same thing all the time. How are you going to tell if there's a difference? So I think it's very plausible that it must be not necessarily the factor. It's very rare in life that you have a single factor because it will depend so much on the individual, how often they're doing it, and so on, what else they do when they're not doing it. But it's clear if you're doing something consistently for a substantial period of time, that will be a factor, because the environment, as you rightly said at the beginning, is a factor. And I think that, yes, it's such an unusual thing to do, to live in a world of 2 dimensions only, and only sight and sound. Yeah, human beings aren't meant to do that. They're meant to move around in 3 dimensions and stimulate all 5 senses.
Well, I actually believe that's coming to us in a new version of Facebook. So,
so
be careful what you wish for.
I know. So it is a very different environment, and therefore, yes, you can habituate to it, which is a psychology term, meaning that you just you're not processing it perhaps as effectively or as, with as much attention as it really merits.
Oh, I'm glad that you think it's at least plausible, and I wouldn't be arguing that it would be the sole factor. The highest I would put it is that it may be a contributing factor. And I think in our observation of the attack status of the world during COVID, we've observed a couple of interesting trends. One is that obviously a lot more people are working from home, and often working longer hours, in fact, in front of screens than they were before, partly because they don't have to travel. And so they're using that traveling time to do more work.
Exactly. Well, you're not exercising as much, probably. Yeah.
Right.
It might be if you're living in a COVID world, you're not socializing as much. So you're eating perhaps in a less balanced way, in a rush, just sort of snacking in front of your screen, rather than having the methodical beginning, end, and middle of a meal and so on. So all of those factors would contribute. Yeah.
So the premise would be something like, and the other thing is that the emotional strain of just the whole COVID phenomenon, the trauma associated with lockdown or family members getting sick. So here's the poor, now remote working employee in front of a screen for, let's say, at least, let's say 8 hours a day. Under more sophisticated attacks that are exploiting their emotional vulnerability.
Yeah, I would have thought so. And also, if they're working away from home, they're missing the water cooler moments. It may be, therefore, that you do lose your judgment. You're not quite as sound in how you evaluate things, because you are so fixated on a rather distorted or very narrow way of seeing things. And therefore, I think the water cooler moments are quite important and the spontaneity of working with other people. You don't quite know what happens. Someone will suddenly pop by and talk to you. And I think those spontaneous encounters not only can lead to stimulating ideas and so on, but they're very important, I say, to recalibrate you back to reality rather than living in this parallel universe.
And the other thing I wanted to throw into the mix was the stress as well, that psychological stress, and I think has long been known to divert resources away from the prefrontal cortex. And so when we're stressed, we revert to using heuristics rather than
Well, when you're stressed, you have to make immediate responses to things. And I think compared to reading a book or having a conversation, a screen demands an immediate response because you get immediate feedback from it, and that speeds up interaction, which is not necessarily a good thing. As you rightly say, the prefrontal cortex, which for the uninitiated is a sophisticated part of the brain in evolutionary terms, and it's exaggerated, particularly in humans. And I like to sum up the functions of prefrontal, is that it gives you a past and a future. If it's damaged, you're living in the moment. But when it's fully functional in the mature adult, it enables you to evaluate the world, not in terms of just the senses, but in terms of your previous experiences. It enables you to plan ahead for the future. Now, if there's an immediate tiger coming at you, or you're in a fight or flight situation, or a surrogate fight or flight situation, as might be the stress of the screen, you don't have time to think through things or to plan ahead. You respond much more quickly with the sort of knee-jerk. So yes, that wouldn't involve the prefrontal cortex, and it would involve certainly less judgment, because you're in a crude term, you're fighting for your life, or you're running for your life. And that involves, of course, as everyone knows, the adrenaline of the fright, which, if that happens over a protracted period of time, leads to damage and chronic stress, because it's out of context.
Right, and then you see things
it's an acute response that's then been hijacked as almost as a way of life or an attitude, you know, and that's very powerful.
Long-term unmanaged stress,
Mm.
we see enlargements in organs of the brain, such as the amygdala, and reductions in the hippocampus. And I think there's a fairly large body of evidence there. So again, circling back to a stress situation and the fact that people are not using their prefrontal cortex, one of the issues around cyber fatigue is a lack of engagement or concern for the consequences of a risk behavior that you are engaging in.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any sense of futurity because you're in the limbic mode, then you're not going to, all the training that they gave you a month ago around not clicking on links or opening attachments is not going to be present to assist you, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting if you look at scenarios where the prefrontal cortex underfunctions in adults. Yeah, the most famous one was someone called Phineas Gage in the 1860s.
Ah, yes.
Who was, I'm sure everyone's heard of this, who's the work on a railway gang, and the explosive went off prematurely and this huge rod was driven through his prefrontal cortex, but he lived to tell the tale, but his whole character changed and became very reckless. So I've often talked about the neuroscience of risk, and I always start with that story, because any neuroscience take on risk starts with a fully functional prefrontal cortex. Young children only have their prefrontal cortex really developed in their late teenage years, actually, or their early 20s. So that accounts for children who very much live in the moment. They're very volatile emotionally. They can't really plan ahead and so on. It's always intrigued me that human beings, everyone, has these two modes. There's times where we put ourselves in scenarios that facilitates the release of dopamine, which therefore facilitates dampening down the prefrontal cortex, so that we say you've lost your mind, you're out of your, we talk about having a sensational time. You don't say let's go and have a cognitive time. Yeah. So those elements, it fits perfectly that we choose sometimes in life to devise means, either by putting ourselves in a very strong sensory environment with very loud music or whitewater rafting or whatever, but so strong and so fast that it actually requires you to make immediate sensational responses or sensory responses. Yeah. Or people take psychoactive drugs, alcohol or drugs, which then will impair the transmission in the brain so that you don't have the connections fully fired up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we enjoy it. That's why we do it. The dopamine system is actually aids and abets that. So there's times when we want to lose our mind, be out of our mind. Yeah? Ecstasy in Greek, ecstasis is to stand outside of yourself. Yeah. So but the whole thing is to get that balance right. And I worry about scenarios when there's too much emphasis placed on disabling your prefrontal cortex for whatever reason.
And so really looking at this through the lens of cybersecurity, we don't want people to be in a dopamine enhanced state.
You do not. No, you don't. You don't want them to be happy, you're going to say. No, it's a different time.
And of course, then we see this bombshell revelations around social media subversion of the dopamine reward system.
Yeah.
As a deliberate part of the business model.
It's very sneaky, and there's people designed to do this. So, for example, texting. What dopamine does, it surges in anticipation of something. Yeah. So if you don't know quite if you're going to get the reward you want, you've got the dopamine there. You know. So.
Let me move to another point in the conversation. Are we correct in saying now that there is sufficient science to support a causal relationship between screen time and brain development?
No, of course, establishing in brain science a cause rather than a correlation is one of the big issues that we struggle with as neuroscientists. How would you actually do that? You know, it's because you can see changes in the brain for sure. It's very hard in neuroscience to say something has caused something else. Yeah, but nonetheless, there are certain studies that are trying to do that. There's one by someone called Jean Twenge, Twenge, and this was some time ago. And she looked at the amount of screen time with the amount of intellectual problems the kids were having in terms of their grade point averages. And she found there was a correlation between the more time they spent on the screen, the more there was a problem with their academic performance. So that's sort of suggestive.
But again, that correlation, I mean,
it's a correlation with the time they're spending. Yeah. But it's very hard. I mean, how would you do it? You see, you'd have to have two groups of people. You'd have to expose one group. They'd have to be exactly the same in terms of whatever skills or performance you're measuring. And then you'd have to subject one group to some screen technologies and the others not. And then you have to, so it would be a very hard thing ethically to do with human beings. You couldn't really do that very readily.
Well,
or
that's
very
why I
easily.
was sort of struck by that Yale study that I referred to at the beginning. I mean, look, you can criticize it for being a small group. It was only over 6 days. But nevertheless, I mean, that was a group that was subjected to a new behavior that they hadn't undergone before. And their brains were scanned pre and post. And the, I suppose it was a morphological or macroscopic change that was observed. So, I mean, I think in those cases where you've got a naive group that is subjected to a specific internet-related behavior, or it doesn't need to be internet, any kind of stress, or sort of plays into my theory around this idea of the relationship between, let's say, emotional exhaustion, stress, cognitive overload, information overload, and people making poor cybersecurity decisions.
Yeah, I don't think necessarily you even have to go to contrive specific experiments, which are quite hard with human beings, but you can look. I think a very important sector is the education sector. And I commend a book called Screen Schooled by Joe Clement and Matt Miles. They're in Washington, DC. And I endorsed it on the front. Now, they're veteran school teachers. Now, school teachers, who people sometimes forget to talk to, they have a front row seat because they, as in the case of Joe and Matt, they've been teachers for 20 years, 30 years. So they can see, without the bias that a parent would have, shifts in the performance, the academic performance of kids, the way they reason, their thinking, their attention. And they can see that objectively from a generation, say 20 years ago to now. And I think they are a very valuable resource, for looking. So I'd certainly recommend this book because, as you might imagine, they are very concerned with looking at what school teachers have experienced over and comparing one generation with the next generation, I think can be very insightful.
Yeah, I think even anecdotal evidence can be persuasive, can't it? So I know I have a friend that's a school teacher, and he says that it's a real challenge these days keeping kids engaged.
Well, they've got the front row. The teachers, they're on the front row, and they see it, and compare with groups. So it can go beyond anecdote if it's something that they all agree on and it's generalized, in the whole class compared to previously. Then you can start to.
He even said that his kids don't listen to a whole song.
Well, there we are.
They won't even listen to an entire. They'll listen to the first 8 seconds or 15 seconds until they get sick of it, and then they just swipe to the next one. Yeah,
well, that's an easier observation doing brain scans. You can actually tell it.
And I observed that behavior in adults as well, which goes back to our original point. I mean, these observations are not limited to kids. Now, kids are not really making cybersecurity decisions, although they probably are making decisions that potentially affect their online safety.
Well, I imagine they will be soon. I mean,
if what we're saying is that prolonged, unmitigated screen exposure is problematic, however we want to define that. And maybe in my case, I would define it in terms of increased probability of making a wrong cybersecurity decision. Then is one suggestion or solution that we just enforce brakes on our...
So it's not so much enforcing brakes, but perhaps having some kind of activity that involves leaving the screen in some way. I can't think, but I always like to think that having a beginning, a middle, and an end, rather than multitasking and doing things instantly. So reading, gardening, walking, sport of all types, those things, music, they all have a very fixed pattern of a beginning, a middle, and end. And you have to do things in a certain order. Things that impose a beginning, a middle, and end. Reading, you start beginning of the book usually and go through to the end. So these really simple activities that have clearly a time frame, beginning, a middle, and end, I think are very therapeutic and important because that's how you think. You think in linearity. You say, I need to be on track and thinking straight and so on. And the man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's ages ago, he said, thinking is movement confined to the brain. A equals B, B equals C, and A equals C. You end up, when you think, you end up in a different place than where you started, yeah? And you got to that different place by a sequence of steps.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, what is it about gardening and cooking and eating,
music and reading and
music that is so qualitatively different? You talk about the linearity. These are different. This calls for a paradigmatic shift. The paradigm itself is the problem. That you,
exactly.
the fact that you can sit in front of a computer.
Yeah, exactly.
For 8 hours straight.
Yeah.
Just for toilet breaks or something.
Yeah. And you have no time and space. You're just there. So somehow one has to introduce this, or an environment where, as well as sitting in the screen, but it's, in a sense, it's getting back to life in the five senses and the 3 dimensions that human beings function
world,
in. Yeah.
Which is probably why we find spending time in nature so restorative.
Totally, we do. And there's published papers comparing.
The high-tech companies try and create a sensorial experience. I remember in Google's headquarters, they had lots of big colored balls that you could just play with. And it was all actually, I think, very stimulating, in fact, but you're getting people out of the left side of their brain. Yeah.
Well, I think the way to do it is, as you're doing, is to persuade people of that they'll be better at their job if they leave the screen from time to time and go for a run, or have a meal with a friend, or slow cook a meal, or perhaps spend half an hour on the piano, or any of those things. Or it might be also that one shifts back to the old paper, that you actually encourage people to write things down or read, because it's that beginning, middle, and end that characterizes the adult human mind. Yeah,
humanity is on a very interesting trajectory. It seems that if we can't address this imbalance, that we risk sort of major shifts in our own capabilities to exercise critical reasoning skills.
Well, indeed, and I think in turn that makes us very vulnerable.
Well, if we could move to a close now, but I was hoping that we could sort of orient the discussion towards some positive suggestions. And you've made a few, and I really like, this return to the real world.
Exactly.
Plea. Yeah. I wonder whether I feel like I'm trying to make a case here, the business case for allowing, on cybersecurity grounds, for allowing remote workers to legitimately take time out during the working day, so that they can go outside for a walk or
exactly
do and without there being sanction. Now, I think there has been a lot more forgiveness. I know that when I have my dog with me and he barks during a call these days, no one's so concerned because they've got their dog or their cat with them as well. So I feel like the pandemic has actually given us some permission, although it's exacerbated some of these problems that we talked about. I think it also is a window of opportunity around this paradigmatic shift that I was
well, I think what we need is to re-empower people. There's so much the consumer in the cyber world, to give people back a sense of their individuality, and their privacy, to respect that in others, obviously, and to be pleased with who you are, not to be the same as other people, not to have this constant anxiety that I think many have of being accepted and approved of. Those things are rather sad, and I think account for a lot of the problems. And if you can help people feel self-fulfilled again by their own standards, then that could be very helpful.
So by fulfilling their emotional needs, even as employers, if we could move to that sort of mindset, we are relieving them of the kind of burden that might be distracting.
They constantly have to conform and impress. If you are an individual and you're seen as such and recognized as such, that is very positive.
So we're trying to bring the humanity back into technology.
Totally. Yeah. If it was ever there.
Well, Baroness Professor Susan Greenfield, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good luck over there in your lockdowns and everything, and I hope it all works out.
Well, everything passes.
Everything does.
We emerge from this in a stronger way. That would be the hope.
Indeed.
Thank you.
All the best then. Take care. Be safe.